This morning I'm joined by Bryony Jenkins from parkmytinyhouse.com.au. Bryony, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here in air-conditioned comfort instead of outside today.
It's gonna get a little warm. Is it already peaking out there, is it?
It's a little, maybe it was just sweaty nerves because coming on the radio is obviously a day-to-day occurrence for most people.
Yeah, obviously, that's how we roll. So, Bryony, you've just been listening to the conversation we've had with Sky about the rental options that are here in Geelong, and that there's a squeeze on everybody is what we really got from Sky. It's a sort of squeeze on renters, there's a squeeze on landlords. Something's got to change. And I wanted to have a conversation because you've got something that maybe is another option that people maybe haven't considered yet. Tell us about tiny homes and tiny houses.
Sure. Well, tiny houses are pretty much my entire personality. I'm known in most of my circles as the tiny house lady.
Bryony, are you 6 foot?
6'3". Nice catch.
I just looked out. That's a lovely height to go in a tiny house. Sorry.
It is. I actually ruled it out many, many years ago, thinking that because I do have a mild case of claustrophobia, thought maybe it wouldn't be a possibility for me because of that, and then financial necessity came into play after my last very fun, messy divorce, and realised that was pretty much my only option if I wasn't going to sleep in my car with my 2 kids as a new single mum. So that's sort of the way that I've come into tiny house living, as it were. That was 7 years ago now.
So was it you looking at the rental market and thinking, well, this is not for me, I need to find another option?
Initially, it was after the divorce. This was 2016, 2017. I was in a pretty bad state in every way, shape and form. I tried to keep the marital home, as most women in my position try to do. You realise very, very quickly that is just not going to be realistic. I moved between rental house to rental house 5 times in 18 months, each time trying to find something cheaper. You know what renting is like. Even back then, 7 years ago, it was the rent is too much. The owner wanted to move in, then they wanted to sell, and then the next one wanted to up the rent. And it just got to a point where the rent was relatively affordable back then. Mine was like $230 a week for a partially subsidised private rental. But even then, they're usually the really badly designed, poorly built ones that are just slapdash, and my utilities were costing more than my rent.
I was going to say they're hot in summer and they're cold in winter.
Horrendous. Okay. And you end up living in one room out of 5 or 6 or 7 anyway, so it just didn't make sense to me. So I downsized everything into a caravan at that point. That was the beginning of my tiny house journey, I guess.
So going into the caravan, did that give you more security? Because it sounds like you weren't very secure. You were moving,
right.
5 times. Was it security that you were looking for as well?
Absolutely. The only thing I walked away from the divorce, other than all the fun and trauma, was a block of land that I had up in Trentham at the time. It was the middle of winter and we moved on to that in the caravan. It was super basic, but it was mine. It was a $2,000 caravan. It was so trashy, but it's the only option I felt like I had available to me. And I was there for nearly a year, which is the most stability we had since the divorce and everything. So it was pretty ironic that I had to go into a caravan to actually have stability.
And I suppose being there for the year, you weren't chewing through rent, which was maybe, I'm guessing, chewing through a nest egg that you may have had. Did that enable you to then take the next step and move forward?
Oh, absolutely. That was life-changing for me. I had a lot of friends in similar situations that were just duck paddling really quickly underwater, just trying to make ends meet all day, every day, permanently in survival mode. Being in the caravan, I didn't have a nest egg. All I had was that block of land. I sold every piece of furniture I had in the very large unit to buy that $2,000 caravan, which was pretty humbling as a 40-something single mum. And that having that caravan for a year meant I had no overheads. I had a very tiny, weeny little water bill, but I had off-grid solar. So I was actually able to pay off all the credit card debt that I'd accumulated just trying to pay my bills and make ends meet when I was in a traditional home. I was able to get in front again and actually have savings, which I'd never had in my entire adult life, to the point where, with a little bit of family help as well, after that 12-month period, I was able to buy my first tiny house.
I love that. I mean, you were in a tiny house, but
it was a tiny house of sorts, yes, which was actually bigger than my first tiny house. So, like the caravan was luxury, really.
When you look back, it's luxury, children. We had luxury back then.
Exactly.
So, when you say you bought your first tiny house, when did you come? When did you come across this concept of the tiny house?
I guess I've been stalking things online since maybe 2015. Everyone knows Bryce Langston from Living Big in a Tiny House. He is like the tiny house god, and he's my height, which is kind of nice.
So is he Australian?
He's a
American?
Kiwi.
Kiwi,
He is
right.
a Kiwi, and he's as lovely in real life as he is on all his videos and everything. So loved that channel, loved watching things in Facebook groups and inspo photos.
So YouTube was your friend in this case?
Definitely,
Yep.
yes.
This was your library. You would go and learn?
Pretty much, yeah. It wasn't so much Facebook and that sort of thing. It was, YouTube back then. Lots of American stuff because the Australian tiny house movement hadn't really kicked off yet, sort of in 2015. There were only a handful of good quality tiny house builders back then. It's a bit of a different story now, 7 or 8 years later.
So what does a tiny house need to be a tiny house? Does it need its own sewage system? Does it need, running water? Like what do you need for it to be a tiny house?
The definition of what a tiny house in Australia is has changed a little bit from what it was originally. The distinction between that and a caravan is probably the first point, because caravans are generally made with materials that are lightweight and they're meant for travel. Tiny houses are generally built with standard building materials. So your timber, the kitchen looks just the same with beautiful bench tops as they are in a traditional house, but they have to be kept under the maximum road legal weight in Australia, which is 4.5 tonnes. Mm-hmm. That's the big kicker.
Because you still need to be able to move it.
Occasionally. Look, they're not meant for travel. I think that's a bit of a misconception because we're not nomads and gypsies. We actually like to go tiny for stability, which is a little bit ironic, isn't it, in the housing market that we're in. They are intended to be moved into position, but generally you leave them there unless you're actually moving interstate or moving for work or whatever. You don't travel with them like a caravan.
So what is the biggest challenge that people who have a tiny house then face? Is it finding somewhere for that to be located?
Absolutely. And that's the reason. Nice segue there. I see what you did. Nice.
Thanks. I've done this before.
Not that was planned. Just an expert here. That's actually the reason that I started the platform, Park My Tiny House. I run a large Facebook group, Tiny Houses Buy and Sell Australia. I was looking at selling my very basic tiny house and upgrading to a new one and realised there was nowhere in Australia with a dedicated Australian tiny house group to start one on Facebook, so I started it. And as a result of that group, I like a good poll. I love a poll. So in that group, I asked the question, what's the one thing stopping you right now from going tiny? And the biggest problem was land. Where do I park this thing?
And secure land. Like
Secure
that it's not
land.
going to be sold underneath me.
Yeah, absolutely. Not all of us have mum and dad's property or acreage somewhere. A lot of people are either choosing not to or are not in a position where they can get a mortgage to buy land. So renting land is a big thing, but there hasn't really been somewhere until now to access that in one spot with people that are actually actively searching for land on your behalf for what meets your requirements.
Okay. So how do we do that? How do we have conversation? How do we, pull up it? I mean, and also I'm guessing not everyone wants to live on acreage. Maybe they need to use public transport, and public transport isn't always out in the, the back blocks of the towns or whatever. The Victorian government, I believe, have changed it, and just tell me if I got this right, changed the regulations lately about what you can have in a normal standard block, another dwelling. Is that right?
Yes and no. A lot of tiny house builders, unfortunately, are promoting this as a big selling point for tiny houses. The recent legislation is to do with granny flats and the planning and building permits required. Tiny houses being on wheels, which is the realm that I deal in, is that new amendment is not applicable.
Ah.
So there's a lot of excitement about the new granny flat laws, and it's a great step in the right direction, but it doesn't actually apply to anything on wheels because they're not subject to planning overlays.
Because granny flats are permanent structures.
Correct, yeah.
And a tiny house is not designed to be permanent because it's designed to be mobile.
It's designed to be mobile primarily to avoid council.
So what changes do we need? What needs to happen next? In the world of Bryony Jenkins, if the world was her oyster, what would you suggest that has to happen?
Councils and governments need to start listening to their constituents more, and instead of paying lip service, actually take action. No more committees, no more working groups, that sort of thing. There's a lot of, I think, bureaucracy that's happening behind the scenes that is preventing actual real change from being made. Councils and governments need to step in and actually create tiny house policies for those of us who choose to live tiny, because we are going to do it regardless, because for many of us there is no choice. In my situation 6 or 7 years ago, I had no choice. Some of us do not have the privilege of being able to spend $1,000 a week on rent or a mortgage or pay rent 6 months in advance to secure rent, which is what's happening with a lot of people in the housing market now. And for those people, we need secure housing. We really don't have an option, a lot of us. Some of us choose this very intentionally, but there's a lot that just are not in the privileged position of having the option. So there needs to be safe ways for us to do that regardless.
All right, you heard it. We need to have some change happening. Because, well, and people are running out of options I think, when we talk to people who provide food for people who are living, in precarious circumstances, we're hearing more and more people living in cars, and that's their safest option, and that's their only option, and often with, numbers of children.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. I have a lot of friends that live in Queensland, and every single one of them knows someone or is someone who sleeps rough in a car, in a tent, councils up in that way. Not so bad in Victoria, because we do have some very forward-thinking councils. Surf Coast Shire recently brought on a new tiny house pilot program a few months ago, where they are actually allowing you a permit to live on either your property or someone else's in a tiny house on wheels that checks a few boxes, which is an excellent step in the right direction. And congrats to them for being open to it and forward-thinking enough. And I'm hoping City of Greater Geelong wants to have those conversations too.
And Bryony's number is, if you'd like to get in touch, City Greater Geelong, to explore the possibility of what might be able to happen. Who is tiny living for?
It's not for everyone. It is not for everyone. You do have to, at this state in the game, have a certain level of resourcefulness about you. I consider myself pretty resourceful. You've got to be able to figure things out. It's harder to get tradies for a tiny house because we're a little bit left of centre. So you do have to figure out how to fix your composting toilet at 3 a.m. and run a generator for your solar sometimes. But there are many people who are physically mobile and able to do it, who don't have a family of 7. If that's you, this is probably not for you right now. For most of us that are physically, mentally capable, it is a great option. It's not a great option for maybe the elderly that might have mobility issues, although single level dwellings on wheels are now becoming much more common. And the people that we deal with on the platform, we are actually seeing a slightly older demographic. We're mostly women that are wanting to go tiny because often, honestly, we're the ones that get screwed with housing. We walk away with so little after divorces, barely 6 figures, which might be enough to buy a tiny house, but certainly not get you into a traditional home. So it's mostly women. Couples and some families are choosing it intentionally, but there's a lot of older single women, sort of my age bracket and up, and many that are even now looking at it as a retirement plan so that they have stability and they can live in their adult child's backyard. Or adult child. What am I doing? Yeah. I've had too much coffee this morning already.
That makes sense in my brain.
In there, the adult child's backyard or somewhere else, and know that that roof can never be taken away from them.
And even if that land is sold, so they still have an asset that they can move somewhere else.
And you can always go somewhere else. There are caravan parks that take long-term residents, and there's always someone else that is happy to open their property to you in exchange for a bit of rent or a work in lieu arrangement.
That's right. And I think it's about having the conversation and putting it out there, maybe accessing a service like yourself at parkmytinyhouse.com.au, where you've got different, people who are coming together. You've got landowners and tiny house peoples coming together and making arrangements. Bryony Jenkins, thank you so much for coming in this morning. Good luck in your hunt for a piece of land on the Bellarine, I believe.
I am, yes. If you're around Ocean Grove, Point Lonsdale, Swan Bay, give me a call. parkmytinyhouse.com.au.
Please. Because this is the location you'd love to live in, and you've got a great little tiny house.
Yeah, I moved down last month. Mum and Dad moved into a retirement village in Point Lonsdale a few month or two ago, just before Christmas. So I'm currently in Mum's and Dad's 3rd bedroom. The retirement village is lovely, and I'm quite excited, honestly, that I'm only 8 years away from being in the age bracket to move into it. But I really would like to be in my own tiny house when it arrives in a few weeks' time. So
good luck with that.